The morning mist clung to the Anacostia River like a shroud of impending doom as British Admiral Alexander Cochrane's fleet cut through the waters of the Chesapeake Bay. It was August 22, 1814, and the crimson-coated veterans of Wellington's peninsular campaigns were about to unleash their fury upon the young American Republic. Major General Robert Ross, a battle-hardened Irishman whose weathered face bore the scars of European warfare, stood at the bow of HMS Tonnant, his piercing blue eyes fixed on the Maryland coastline. The War of 1812 had reached its most critical juncture. Napoleon's recent abdication had freed thousands of British regulars for service in America, and Ross commanded 4,000 of the finest soldiers the Crown could muster. These were not the green militia that had stumbled through earlier campaigns, but seasoned professionals who had broken French squares at Salamanca and stormed the walls of Badajoz. In Washington, Secretary of War John Armstrong dismissed the British threat with characteristic arrogance. "Baltimore is their object," he declared to President James Madison, waving his hand dismissively at reports of enemy ships in the Patuxent River. Armstrong's miscalculation would prove catastrophic. While he focused on defending Fort McHenry, Ross was already planning something far more audacious, a direct assault on the American capital itself. Brigadier General William Henry Winder, commanding the hastily assembled 10th Military District, found himself in an impossible position. A Baltimore lawyer turned reluctant warrior, Winder had been captured by the British at Stony Creek the previous year and released on parole. Now he faced the humiliating prospect of defending his own capital with a motley collection of militia, regulars and volunteers numbering barely 7,000 men. The British landing at Benedict, Maryland, on August 19th sent shockwaves through the region. Ross's force moved with mechanical precision, their red columns snaking through the tobacco fields and pine forests of southern Maryland like a crimson serpent. American scouts brought increasingly alarming reports. These were not the typical British forces they had faced before, but elite units with decades of combat experience. According to contemporary accounts from the National Intelligencer newspaper, panic began to grip Washington as word spread of the British advance. Commodore Joshua Barney, the grizzled naval veteran commanding a flotilla of gunboats on the Patuxent, recognized the gravity of the situation. Rather than allow his vessels to fall into enemy hands, he ordered them scuttled and prepared his 400 sailors for land combat. These weathered seamen, accustomed to the rolling decks of warships, would soon find themselves manning artillery pieces on Maryland soil. As Ross's army pushed northward through Upper Marlboro, the temperature soared into the 90s. British soldiers, accustomed to European climes, wilted under their heavy wool uniforms and 60-pound packs. Yet their discipline never wavered. They had marched across Spain in worse conditions, and the promise of prize money from capturing an enemy capital drove them forward. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the young American Republic. In the sweltering heat of a Maryland summer, two armies prepared to clash at a sleepy crossroads town called Bladensburg, where a handful of bridges spanning the eastern branch of the Potomac would become the gateway to either American salvation or British triumph. Dawn broke gray and oppressive on August 24, 1814, as General Winder's ragtag army stumbled into position along the hills overlooking Bladensburg. The small Maryland town, normally a quiet tobacco port where farmers brought their crops to market, had suddenly become the last barrier between 4,000 British veterans and the American capital 6 miles to the southwest. Winder's defensive plan, hastily conceived and poorly communicated, stretched his forces across 3 separate lines on the western bank of the eastern branch. The first line, positioned closest to the river, consisted of Maryland militia under Brigadier General Tobias Stansbury. These citizen soldiers, many of whom had never fired a shot in anger, clutched their muskets with white knuckles as they peered across the water at the empty streets of Bladensburg. The second line, anchored on higher ground, included the District of Columbia militia and a battery of artillery commanded by Captain Benjamin Birch. Secretary of State James Monroe, despite having no military authority, had ridden out from Washington and was busily rearranging troops without consulting Winder, a meddling that would contribute to the coming disaster. Commodore Barney's sailors and Marines formed a crucial part of the third line, their naval Discipline a stark contrast to the nervous energy of the surrounding militia. The old sea dog himself, scarred from decades of fighting pirates and privateers, supervised the placement of his 18-pound guns with professional competence. These would prove to be the only American artillery pieces positioned to effectively engage the enemy. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the Maryland countryside, Ross's British column approached Bladensburg from the northeast. The general himself rode at the head of his light brigade, his uniform immaculate despite 3 days of marching through the summer heat. Behind him, the 85th Light Infantry advanced in perfect formation, their buttons gleaming and their bayonets fixed. The sight that greeted Ross as he crested the hill overlooking Bladensburg must have filled him with grim satisfaction. The American position, while defensible in theory, was fatally flawed in execution. The 3 defensive lines were too far apart to provide mutual support, and the eastern branch, while presenting an obstacle to attacking forces, also prevented any organized American retreat. Contemporary British accounts, including those found in the London Gazette, described the American defensive preparations as confused and contradictory. Colonel Arthur Brooke, Ross's second-in-command and veteran of the Peninsular War, studied the American positions through his telescope. A professional soldier who had learned his trade fighting French marshals, Brooke immediately identified the weaknesses in Winder's deployment. The bridge across the eastern branch created a natural choke point, but the Americans had failed to destroy it or establish adequate crossfire to defend it. As noon approached, the temperature climbed toward 100 degrees Fahrenheit. British soldiers, their red wool uniforms dark with sweat, began shedding their heavy packs in preparation for battle. Ross, ever mindful of his men's welfare, ordered a brief halt to allow them to drink from their canteens and check their weapons. The general himself dismounted and walked among his troops, offering words of encouragement and reminding them of their recent victories in Europe. On the American side, confusion reigned. Messengers galloped back and forth between the scattered defensive positions, carrying contradictory orders from Winder, Monroe, and other self-appointed commanders. Many of the militia had never participated in a proper military formation, and their officers struggled to maintain even basic discipline as the enemy drew near. The sound of British drums echoing across the Maryland hills served as an ominous prelude to the carnage that was about to unfold. As Ross's advance guard reached the outskirts of Bladensburg, the fate of Washington, and perhaps the entire American experiment, hung in the balance of the next few hours. The first British skirmishers emerged from the tree line east of Bladensburg at precisely 12:30 in the afternoon, their green uniforms marking them as men of the elite 95th Rifles. These were the same troops who had harassed French columns across the Spanish peninsula, masters of individual marksmanship and woodland fighting. They moved with practiced stealth along the banks of the eastern branch, seeking covered positions from which to engage the American first line. General Ross, mounted on his bay charger, surveyed the battlefield with the calculating eye of a veteran commander. The stone bridge spanning the eastern branch presented his only viable crossing point for artillery and formed columns, though he noted with professional interest that the Americans had failed to barricade or destroy it. Such an oversight would have been unthinkable against French opposition, but Ross had already observed that American military competence varied dramatically from unit to unit. The opening shots rang out at 1 o'clock as Rifle Corps marksmen began picking off American militia officers across the river. The crack of Baker rifles, with their distinctive sharp report, sent ripples of nervousness through Stansbury's Maryland troops. These farmers and shopkeepers had drilled on weekends and attended the occasional muster, but the reality of combat, the whistle of bullets overhead and the screams of wounded men, proved far different from their peaceful preparations. Lieutenant Colonel William Thornton of the 85th Light Infantry received Ross's order to advance across the bridge with characteristic British stoicism. A veteran of Badajoz and Ciudad Rodrigo, Thornton had led forlorn hopes against French fortifications far more formidable than anything the Americans could muster. He formed his light companies into attack columns and prepared to storm across the narrow stone span under fire. The charge that followed would be remembered as one of the most audacious tactical movements in British military history. Thornton's men, their scarlet uniforms brilliant in the afternoon sun, advanced at the double quick across the bridge while American musket balls whistled around them. The narrow causeway forced them into a vulnerable column formation, but their discipline held firm even as men fell wounded into the waters below. Reports from the Baltimore American newspaper later described the British advance as conducted with a fearlessness that bordered on the supernatural. Captain Birch's American artillery opened fire as the red-coated infantry reached the western bank, sending round shot crashing through the British ranks. The thunderous roar of 6-pound guns momentarily drowned out the crack of musketry, and, for a brief moment it appeared that American firepower might halt the enemy advance. But Thornton's veterans, trained in the harsh school of European warfare, simply closed ranks around their fallen comrades and continued forward. The psychological effect on the American militia proved devastating. Many of Stansbury's men had never heard artillery fire in earnest, and the sight of British soldiers continuing to advance despite taking casualties shattered their confidence. Individual militiamen began falling back from their positions, and what started as a tactical withdrawal quickly devolved into a panicked retreat. Brigadier General Stansbury himself, a Baltimore merchant with more courage than military experience, attempted to rally his troops by riding back and forth behind their line. His efforts proved futile as more and more militia abandoned their positions and streamed toward the rear. The carefully planned first defensive line, which Winder had hoped would delay the British advance for hours, collapsed in less than 30 minutes. Ross, observing the rout from his command position, immediately ordered his reserve companies forward to exploit the breakthrough. The 44th East Essex Regiment, fresh from their victories at Salamanca, advanced in perfect formation to support Thornton's assault troops. Their measured pace and unwavering discipline presented a stark contrast to the chaos among American forces. As the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Maryland countryside, the Battle of Bladensburg had barely begun, yet already the outcome seemed inevitable. The British war machine, honed to perfection through 20 years of European conflict, was grinding inexorably toward the American capital. The collapse of the first American line sent shockwaves through General Winder's remaining forces positioned on the higher ground west of Bladensburg. What had been conceived as a fighting withdrawal to successive defensive positions instead became a cascading retreat as panic spread through the ranks of inexperienced militia. Secretary of State Monroe, still meddling in military affairs despite his lack of authority, rode frantically between units attempting to restore order, but his civilian authority carried little weight with soldiers already gripped by fear. Colonel Thornton's British light infantry, having secured the bridge and driven off Stansbury's militia, immediately began forming for their next assault. These veterans understood the importance of maintaining momentum in battle, and Thornton had no intention of allowing the Americans time to reorganize their shattered defenses. The 85th Regiment's disciplined advance continued up the slope toward the 2nd American line, their bayonets glinting in the harsh afternoon sun. The 2nd defensive position, anchored around a hill overlooking the Bladensburg-Washington Road, was held by District of Columbia militia under Colonel George Minor and a mixed force of regulars and volunteers. Among these troops stood the 5th Maryland Regiment, which had seen action earlier in the war and possessed somewhat more combat experience than their fleeing comrades. Captain Benjamin Birch's artillery battery, repositioned from the 1st line, wheeled their 6-pound guns into action and began sending round shot into the advancing British columns. Ross himself crossed the bridge at the head of his reserve battalions, the 44th East Essex and 4th King's Own regiments maintaining perfect formation despite the increasing American artillery fire. The general's presence on the field electrified his troops, who had served under him through the grueling peninsular campaigns. These were soldiers who had seen French Imperial Guard broken at Vittoria and watched Napoleon's Eagles retreat across the Pyrenees. The fighting for the 2nd American position proved more stubborn than the initial collapse at the river. The PAMA mixed force of regulars and militia held their ground for nearly an hour, trading volleys with Thornton's advance guard, while Birch's artillery continued to tear gaps in the British ranks. For a brief moment, it appeared that American resistance might stiffen and force Ross to deploy his full strength in a costly frontal assault. Historical accounts from the Washington National Intelligencer noted that the 2nd position showed what American forces might accomplish with proper leadership and preparation. However, The fundamental weakness of militia forces soon became apparent. As British casualties mounted and their disciplined advance continued, individual American soldiers began to waver. The sight of their comrades falling under enemy fire, combined with the relentless pressure of veteran troops who seemed immune to fear, gradually eroded American morale. When a British flanking movement threatened to envelop their left wing, Colonel Minor ordered a withdrawal that quickly degenerated into another rout. The retreat of the second line exposed Commodore Barney's naval battery, positioned on a hill, roughly a mile from the original American positions. The old Commodore, his weathered face grim with determination, watched the approaching disaster with the calculating eye of a man who had spent his life in desperate fights against superior odds. His 400 sailors and Marines represented the most disciplined American force on the field, and Barney intended to make the British pay dearly for their advance. As fleeing militia streamed past his position toward Washington, Barney's men prepared their 18-pound naval guns for action. These heavy pieces, originally intended for ship-to-ship combat, possessed the firepower to devastate infantry formations at close range. The Commodore himself sighted the lead gun, drawing on decades of experience in naval gunnery to calculate range and deflection. The British advance, which had proceeded with machine-like efficiency through the first two American positions, suddenly met a wall of disciplined fire from Barney's battery. Round shot and grape shot tore through Thornton's light infantry, sending the surviving soldiers scrambling for cover. For the first time in the battle, the British advance ground to a halt as Ross's veterans encountered American troops who refused to break under pressure. General Ross, observing the fierce resistance from his new command position, recognized that he faced a different caliber of opponent. The sailors manning those guns possessed the same professional competence he had come to expect from British naval forces, and their determination to hold their ground threatened to disrupt his entire tactical plan. The afternoon was growing late, and Washington lay tantalizingly close, but first he would have to break this final knot of American resistance. Commodore Joshua Barney stood defiantly behind his battery of naval guns as the remnants of two American defensive lines streamed past his position in disorder. The grizzled sea captain, his uniform coat opened against the oppressive heat, watched the approaching British columns with the same steely resolve that had carried him through countless naval engagements during the Revolution and the current war. His 400 sailors and Marines, drawn from the crews of scuttled gunboats, represented the final organized American resistance between General Ross and the capital city. The Commodore's position on the hill commanded an excellent field of fire down the Bladensburg-Washington road, and his 18-pound naval guns possessed far greater hitting power than the field artillery that had already withdrawn. These heavy pieces, designed to batter enemy warships at sea, could devastate infantry formations with devastating effectiveness. Barney himself took position behind the center gun, personally sighting the weapon with the precision that had made him one of America's most feared naval commanders. Ross, surveying the American position through his spyglass, immediately recognized the tactical challenge before him. The naval battery occupied commanding ground and was manned by professionals who would not break at the first sign of pressure. Unlike the militia that had melted away before his advance, these sailors possessed the discipline and experience to make his next assault extremely costly. The British general faced a dilemma. A frontal attack would succeed eventually, but at what price in casualties? The solution came from Lieutenant Colonel Thornton, whose light infantry had already proven their worth in crossing the bridge and breaking the first two American lines. The aggressive colonel proposed a combined frontal assault and flanking, movement that would divide Barney's attention and prevent him from concentrating his fire. Ross approved the plan, ordering the 4th King's Own Regiment to advance directly up the road while Thornton's 85th Light Infantry worked around the American left flank. According to period accounts preserved in the British Army Historical Research Society, Ross later praised Thornton's tactical acumen as instrumental in the victory. The assault began at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, with the thunderous roar of Barney's naval guns opening fire on the advancing British columns. The first discharge sent 18-pound round shot, crashing through the ranks of the 4th King's Own, leaving gaps that were immediately closed by the sergeant's harsh commands. The disciplined redcoats continued forward, their muskets at the ready, while the naval battery reloaded with grape shot for close-range work. Barney's sailors worked their guns with practiced efficiency, their years of experience handling heavy ordnance under combat conditions serving them well in this land battle. The Commodore himself supervised the loading and firing of each piece, ensuring that every shot counted. His Marines, armed with muskets, provided covering fire against British skirmishers attempting to pick off the gun crews. The flanking movement by Thornton's light infantry, however, began to tell as British marksmen worked their way around the American position. The elite 95th Rifles, experts in individual combat, began picking off Barney's officers and gun captains with their accurate Baker rifles. The Commodore himself, conspicuous in his naval uniform, became a prime target as British bullets whistled around his position. As the range closed, the intensity of combat reached its peak. British infantry pressed forward with bayonets fixed while American naval guns belched grape shot into their ranks. The air filled with the acrid smoke of black powder and the screams of wounded men from both sides. Barney's position, which had seemed impregnable from a distance, gradually became untenable as British flanking forces threatened to envelope his battery. The decisive moment came when a British musket ball struck Commodore Barney in the thigh, sending the old Sea Dog crashing to the ground beside his beloved guns. With their commander wounded and British infantry closing from multiple directions, the naval battery's resistance finally began to crumble. Individual sailors began falling back toward Washington, carrying their wounded Commodore with them. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the last organized American resistance at Bladensburg had been broken. The road to Washington lay open before Ross's triumphant army, with only scattered groups of fleeing militia between the British columns and the American capital. The Commodore's brave stand had delayed the enemy advance by barely an hour, but his sailors had at least shown that American forces could fight with professional competence when properly led and positioned. The sun hung low in the western sky as General Ross reformed his scattered battalions for the final advance on Washington. The Battle of Bladensburg was over, decided in less than 4 hours of fighting that had seen 3 successive American defensive lines crumble before British bayonets. The cost had been surprisingly light for Ross's army, fewer than 300 casualties against American losses that would never be accurately tallied, as most of the militia had simply melted away into the Maryland countryside. Commodore Barney, his wounded leg roughly bandaged, was carried before General Ross as a prisoner of war. The British commander, demonstrating the chivalry expected of 18th century officers, immediately ordered his personal surgeon to attend to the Commodore's wounds and provided him with a carriage for transport. This gesture of respect between professional warriors stood in stark contrast to the chaos and confusion that had characterized much of the American defense. President Madison, who had ridden out to observe the battle from a safe distance, witnessed firsthand the collapse of his nation's military forces. The sight of militia throwing away their muskets and fleeing in panic must have been particularly galling to a man who had authored much of the Constitution and helped guide the young republic through its formative years. Secretary of War Armstrong's confident predictions about British intentions had proven catastrophically wrong, and now the enemy stood poised to capture the seat of American government. As Ross's columns reformed for the march on Washington, patrols reported that the capital appeared to be in full evacuation. Government officials, members of Congress, and ordinary citizens alike were fleeing westward across the Potomac River, carrying whatever valuables they could manage. Dolly Madison, the president's remarkable wife, had already supervised the removal of important state documents and George Washington's portrait from the executive mansion, displaying a composure that contrasted sharply with the panic gripping the rest of the city. The British advance resumed at 6 o'clock, with Thornton's light infantry leading the way down the dusty road toward the American capital. These battle-tested soldiers, their uniforms stained with sweat and powder smoke, marched with the confident stride of men who had just won a decisive victory. Behind them came the main body of Ross's army, disciplined columns of infantry who had proven once again that British military professionalism could overcome inferior opponents regardless of numerical odds. Contemporary British accounts, later published in the Times of London, described the march on Washington as a triumph of military discipline over American confusion. As the British columns crested the hills overlooking Washington, The sight that greeted them must have been both satisfying and sobering. The young capital, with its half-finished government buildings and wide, dusty avenues, lay spread out below them like a prize waiting to be claimed. Yet Ross, veteran of European campaigns where cities were routinely sacked, understood the political implications of what he was about to do. This would not be merely a military victory, but a symbolic blow to American independence itself. The decision to burn the public buildings of Washington, the Capitol, the Executive Mansion, and other symbols of American government, would be made in the coming hours. Ross and Admiral Cochrane would justify their actions as retaliation for American destruction of York, modern Toronto, the previous year. But the truth was more complex. The burning of Washington would represent the culmination of British frustration with American naval victories and privateering successes that had embarrassed the Royal Navy throughout the war. As twilight descended over the Maryland countryside, on August 24, 1814, the Battle of Bladensburg entered history as one of the most lopsided defeats in American military annals. The engagement had lasted less than 4 hours, but its consequences would reverberate for generations. British forces had demonstrated their overwhelming superiority in conventional warfare, while American militia had shown their fundamental inadequacy when facing professional soldiers. Yet even in defeat, there were lessons to be learned and examples of courage to be remembered. Commodore Barney's naval battery had fought with distinction, proving that American forces could match British professionalism when properly trained and led. The disaster at Bladensburg would ultimately serve as a catalyst for military reform and a reminder that independence, once won, required constant vigilance and professional competence to maintain. The road to Washington lay open, and within hours, the British would begin their systematic destruction of the symbols of American government. But the young republic would survive this humiliation, learning from its mistakes and emerging stronger from the crucible of defeat. The Battle of Bladensburg would be remembered not for American victory, but for the hard lessons it taught about the price of unpreparedness in a dangerous world.